Okay, so we're going to start on animals today. Let me get the lights. So animals are a pretty broad topic, and there's a lot of diversity in animals. And really, part of this I just want you to know, and what we're going to kind of go in today is what is an animal. But we're then going to start looking at some groups of animals, and your book goes into all kinds of details about different groups. I'm kind of picking and choosing, so focus on what's on my lecture slides, because I'm only picking a few of the groups, because you could spend an incredible amount of time learning about every single animal group. And you're welcome to do that, but the ones that I focus on will be the ones that will be tested on. First off, we want to figure out how do we tell animal from a non-animal. So you might have some ideas. So we're going to play a little game to start with. This is a really easy one, right? So which one is an animal? The one on the left or the one on the right? All right, the one on the right. So you should know that my dog, whose name is Darwin, is an animal. So he's a dog. And the tree is not an animal. So sometimes it's very clear, especially with things that we're very aware of, especially with mammals, and maybe with some other things. So here's some other pictures of things that you might or might not know. This next one you should be able to get as well. So which one of these two is an animal? All right, the one on the left, right? So on the right is a sunflower, and on the left is something called a tube worm. So these live underwater, and that's actually a worm, and there's a little kind of tube that the worm lives in, and it looks like this. Actually, it looks like a little flower underwater when it's feeding. If you swim right up to it, it's going to suck into the tube and hide from you, and so you won't see the flowery part. But at this point, it is an animal. Here it's getting a little more difficult. So how about these two? The one on the right or the one on the left? Which one do you think is an animal? All right. Pretty good job. Anyone know what it might be? Actually, no. It does kind of look like it. It's a little hard to see, but it's actually a crab. It's called, the left is a green alga called Halimeda, and the right is actually a crab called a Halimeda crab. But it's really hard to see. It adorns itself with all this greenness on it, and yeah, you really can't see the crab. It does look a little like a seahorse, right? Yeah, but it's not. It's actually a crab that has green bits on it to make it look more like seaweed. All right, how about here? These two red things. Which one do you think is an animal? Because one of them is. All right, so the left versus the right? All right, so one of them is, again, a seaweed, is red algae, and one of them is coral. This one is actually coral. So that one's coral, and that one is a red algae, type of red algae. So it's amazing how many animals look like seaweed in the ocean. It's really, that's why most of my pictures are from the ocean, because that's what I'm familiar with. All right, how about here? Hey, there we go. Yeah, this one's a trick because they're both animals. The left one is a sponge, and the right one is a sea star. So you guys did pretty well. Oh, good job. Some of them are really tricky, though. It's really hard to tell the difference between a coral, which has animal in it, and red algae, which there are coralline algae that look exactly the same. Partially because the coral, which is an animal, has algae living in it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what are the characteristics of animals? Any ideas of what makes an animal an animal? All right, but not all of them do, right? Because we're going to talk about some at the start of this that actually don't have those parts. So sponges, coral, they don't have a heart, right? All right. Any other ideas of what makes an animal an animal? Hey, all right. So have you been reading ahead? All right. Yeah, that's one of the characteristics. So there are no animals that generate their own food. Though there are some exceptions, actually. There's a sea slug that steals chloroplasts and photosynthesizes, but it first has to feed to get those chloroplasts. So it's actually not one, there's no one characteristic that really makes an animal an animal. There's actually a whole bunch of them. We know that animals are monophyletic, so they are a single clade, and that's something we were talking about before, which means that they have a common ancestor that's different than all other eukaryotes. So they share a common ancestor, and we're going to talk about vertebrates and invertebrates as we go along here, but animals are monophyletic, which is unlike things like protists or seaweeds. They're polyphyletic. All right, and just, our language, because we are an animal, our language gets kind of muddled. We often say the word organism when we mean animal. We often also say the word vertebrate when we mean animal, whereas most animals are invertebrates, as we'll see. So things get a little tricky. If I want to describe what an animal is, I actually am going to need a whole bunch of characteristics. And you'll see as we go through, I'm going to talk about some different types of animals and how different they are. And without all these different characteristics, you wouldn't be able to include all those organisms that are monophyletic. So part of this comes out of that we are now grouping things based on common ancestry, not based on how similar they look today to us. So it gets difficult to define things. So there are 4 characteristics that I'm going to use to define an animal, and we're going to start by going through those 4 characteristics and talking about what is meant by them. One is that animals are multicellular. So we've talked a lot about unicellular eukaryotes, talked about protists, a lot of different types of protists. All animals, at least at some point in their life, are going to be multicellular. They could have a unicellular instant in their life, but they are multicellular. They are heterotrophic eukaryotes. So we'll talk about what that means, but heterotrophic means that they feed. So that is a key characteristic to them. They don't make their own food. They're not autotrophs. They are heterotrophic, and they are eukaryotes. Number 3, they have tissues that develop from embryonic layers. So they all actually begin their life developing in the same way. And I'm going to show you that today, the first few steps of it. They diverge greatly once they start developing, but the first few cell divisions we'll see is pretty much the same for every single animal. They have the same development. And number 4, most of them reproduce sexually. There are exceptions. There are some animals that can switch between sexual and asexual reproduction, but most of them do. So that's probably not a very good character for defining an animal. So really, the first 3, multicellular, heterotrophic eukaryotes that have tissues that develop from embryonic layers, not a very clear-cut definition, not something you would go and tell your neighbors about, but those are what we use to define animals. Okay, so it's not a very straightforward kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these 4 in a little more detail. So multicellular. Animals are multicellular. They do not have cell walls. So we've seen cell walls in bacteria. We've seen cell walls in plants. We've seen cell walls in a number of different protists. Animal cells do not have cell walls. Instead, they have this elaborate extracellular matrix that includes a molecule called collagen. And collagen is unique to animals, so it's not found in other organisms. So collagen is what's called a glycoprotein, which means it has a sugar, so it has a carbohydrate attached to a protein. And on this graphic, the proteins are pink and the carbohydrates are green there. So you've got this kind of mixture of them making up your cell matrix. Okay, there's also, in addition to this, that it's multicellular, lacks cell walls, has extracellular matrix rather than a cell wall, and collagen is one of the components that makes up a lot of that extracellular matrix, there are two types of cells that are only ever found in animals. These are muscle cells and nerve cells. So most animals have these two, not all of them, but most animals have muscle cells and nerve cells. And they're, of course, responsible for two major things: movement. So muscle cells allow for movement of animals, and most animals move to some extent. And nerve cells allow for transport of, or conducting nerve impulses, conducting signals across distances in an animal. Because they're multicellular, they often need to transmit signals from one place to another. Okay, so multicellular with cell specialization, these are two of the specialized cells. We're going to see that some animals, like sponges, have some cell specialization, but they don't have as much as some of the other animals, like some of our other invertebrates and vertebrates. Okay. So number one was multicellular. Number two, animals are heterotrophic. So they do not make their own food. Instead, they rely on eating food. So they rely on their food for energy, and that food needs to come from diet, from ingesting things. The diet supplies chemical energy, organic molecules, and essential nutrients. Here's just a table of some essential amino acids and where they might come from. So there's a lot of amino acids, which, if you recall, are the building blocks of proteins, that we cannot get by making them ourselves. We have to get from our diet. So methionine, valine, threonine, phenylalanine, leucine, and isoleucine all come from corn. Beans can give us some of those, as well as tryptophan and lysine. So there's different amino acids, essential amino acids, that are necessary for life that we cannot manufacture ourselves. So we need to get them from mostly autotrophs to some extent. All right. We also get things like minerals, vitamins, essential fatty acids, some other things from eating food. Okay. So animals ingest their food before digestion, so they need to take it into their body somehow. Food is taken in, then taken apart, and then taken up. And that's basically a process that's very similar for the majority of animals. Animals outside of that, they can survive off of a pretty broad range of food sources. So there are herbivores. They only eat autotrophs. They only eat plant matter. There are carnivores that only eat meat sources. They don't eat primary producers, which we'll get into. They eat consumers. And then there are omnivores like us that can eat pretty much anything. We can eat plant matter. We can eat herbivores. We can eat herbivores, right? We can eat at many different levels. So basically the only thing that's common for animals is that they have to eat. They're heterotrophic. They obtain their organic material by eating other organisms or substances derived from them. So obviously we can get things like milk and butter and other products that flours and things like that, things that we've derived from other organisms. Okay. So that's number two. Third thing that makes an animal is that they develop, and they develop in a similar way. So adult animals will vary pretty widely in their morphology, and morphology is their structure, their outward appearance, how they're made up. However, the network of genes, the genes that have led to their development, are pretty similar for most animals. So, and the basis, the very beginning of development, is pretty similar for most animals. So there are, for example, there is a group of genes called Hox genes, which you don't need to remember the name of that. It's a family of genes that's pretty important for embryo development and regulation of other genes that influence morphology, and those genes are the same in virtually all animals. The timing of when those genes are turned on or turned off changes pretty drastically, and Yeah, that's pretty much one of the biggest things that leads to differential development, but the genes themselves are the same. So a lot of what makes us different from other mammals is just what order these genes are turned on and when they're turned on, and that has caused us to have a longer arm or a shorter arm or something than other organisms, or same thing with how our skull develops. So when do those bones start growing and when do they stop growing? Will determine a lot about the structure and the morphology of an organism. Whereas the basis of it, what those genes are, is pretty similar for all different animals. So I'm going to show you a video in a second, but I just want to talk about some of the common developmental stages, and then I'm going to show you a video actually taken of a sea urchin early development that shows this. And this is pretty much the same thing that happens for all animals. So after fertilization, so after sperm and egg meet up, they form a zygote. The zygote is then going to go through mitosis. It's going to go through some cell division. And at first, it just divides, and it actually doesn't do much growing. It just divides and stays the same size. So it divides from 1 cell to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. So this would be what an 8-cell stage embryo looks like. This is a process called cleavage. And then that 8-cell embryo continues to divide. So it becomes 16 and then 32. And eventually, it forms a ball. And the ball is called a blastula. And it's actually a hollow ball. It has something called a blastocele inside of it. That's the cross-section. It's just this hollow ball of cells. And this happens in all animals. It ends up being like this. Things start to change. Well, actually, the next step also happens the same. What results from it is a little bit different. So what's going to happen then after this is that this hollow ball of cells will start to fold on itself. This is called gastrulation. So the cleavage leads to the formation of a multicellular stage called the blastula. And then following the blastula stage, it's going to fold in a process called gastrulation to form a gastrula. And gastrulation actually leads to different embryonic tissue layers and actually leads to us having our GI tract. So because of this folding, we end up having a hollow tube in the center of our body, which lots of animals do. Most animals have a hollow space, and it allows you to form your gut, the inside of your gut, by doing this. So we fold in to have 2 cell layers, and this is the same thing that happens. So from this point, there's some divergence in what animals do. So things like a sponge don't actually do much more than this. They just start growing, and they end up having these very few cell layers with a fold in it, and the fold, they actually, we'll see sponges take water in, and then they expel water out, and they don't have all that complicated of a lifestyle. For animals such as mammals and reptiles and lizards, so all your vertebrates, there's more that happens here, but we've now created either the mouth or we've created the anus of that individual, and they can start having a gut system forming from this. So this process here, embryonic development by and formation of layers of cells, is pretty similar for all organisms. So your book does go into more detail about what happens after this. It talks about a coelom and pseudocoelom and stuff like that. A lot of that we're not going to go into much of that detail because it's already enough. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the development of a sea urchin. And let's hope this works. Let me just refresh this. Okay. So here's a time-lapse video of sea urchin developing. So here it would be the fertilized egg. Here's it's starting to divide. So it's going through mitosis. So it goes to 2 cells. And then 4 cells. And so it skipped ahead now. This is your blastula. So you're seeing this ring of cells, and it's actually starting to form some cells on the inside of it. And you'll see gastrulation start, so it's starting to fold in on itself and create the center cavity. And you know, looking at this, looking at a sea urchin doing this, you'd hardly know the difference if you were looking at a human embryo doing this. They look pretty similar at that stage. So that was those first few steps. So after that, things start to diverge. You can see that even YouTube has now picked up images of human cells developing and images of a chicken cell developing. And you know, if you want to surf around on YouTube a bit for embryonic development, and you can see lots of videos of different animals, and they all start that way. They start with single cell dividing, and then forming a ball of cells, and then the ball folding in on itself. So something that is common to all animals is that process of cell division. Okay. Okay. The fourth characteristic that is common to animals is that they reproduce. And this is common to all organisms. All organisms have to reproduce in some way. Most animals will reproduce sexually. It's something that's pretty common to them. Some of them will have options. Some of them might be able to develop asexually, or some might have asexual parts of their lives. But the large majority, pretty much all animals, have at least some part of their life where they are sexually reproducing. The diploid stage dominates life history. So if you remember back to plants, we had cases like moss where we had a haploid stage that dominated the life history of that plant. But in the case of animals, they're pretty much all diplontic. And by this, I mean they don't have alternation of generations. So how a moss went from a haploid, kind of the haploid green part of the moss, and then it had that stalk that came out of the top that was diploid. They actually had a multicellular haploid part and a multicellular diploid part. In animals, that doesn't happen. You actually have this direct life history where they produce sperm and egg. Those sperm and egg don't divide. They don't become multicellular. They fertilize, the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then you get development into a diploid again. So for animals, they're only haploid as a single cell, as a sperm or an egg cell. So there's no alternate of generations. Okay, and all right, in most species, the sperm is flagellated, and the small flagellated sperm will fertilize a large non-motile egg. In some organisms, like these frogs, fertilization is external, so the female lays a whole bunch of eggs, the male then spreads sperm on them, and they get fertilized externally. Some organisms, it's going to be internal fertilization. That's variable, and we'll look at some of those different cases as we go through the different animal groups. Okay, so just to summarize, what makes an animal an animal? Animals are multicellular, they are heterotrophic, they are eukaryotes, and they have tissues that develop from embryonic layers. Those are really the big three. Multicellular, heterotrophic eukaryotes with tissues that develop from embryonic layers. They're defined as a suite of characters because there are exceptions to all of these, pretty much. So we'll look at some exceptions, but really there's a lot of different varieties that fall within these things. So again, there are some animals that are not sexually reproducing. There are some animals that can photosynthesize because they capture chloroplasts. There are some exceptions to these things. But overall, animals are monophyletic, so they've descended from a common ancestor. So we have to include all of these, even the weird ones that kind of fall outside of this normal suite of characters. Okay. But really, the take-home message, animals are pretty diverse, so it's hard to define them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on every single group of possible things. We're just going to look at a few of them, and with what time is left today, I'm going to start talking about a few different groups of animals, and then we'll finish up next class with the rest of them, and we'll kind of finish with vertebrates, with ones that are most similar to us as we go forward. So there are lots and lots of different body plans that make up animals. So animal evolution has led to a diverse form. There are flying animals, there are swimming animals, there are animals that are almost attached but can move. There are clear animals, there are very colorful animals, there are lots of different forms to them. But all the forms kind of fall within certain boundaries. Animals are subject to processes that we've talked about throughout the course, so diffusion, they need the ability to move in response to things, they need to be able to exchange heat with their environments. There's lots of kind of things that you can learn about throughout the course of maybe a course on invertebrates or vertebrates that will lead to these things. For example, aquatic animals are constrained by the environment that they live in. So looking at these 4 different aquatic animals, you can probably pretty quickly see which ones are adapted for speed, and you get things like the penguin here, that is a bird that's adapted for swimming really well, and then you have the fish that is adapted for swimming very fast. And they have the similar bodies. They're very streamlined. They're pointed at both ends. They're able to swim very well through the water. So it's a penguin versus a tuna. So they have developed these processes through convergent evolution, which is something we talked about. And then you have other animals that have been adapted in the water to not have to swim away. The octopus here is a pretty decent swimmer, but it also has some defense mechanisms, and a lot of them can actually change color to camouflage themselves. The sea dragon here is very well adapted for camouflage, so it doesn't have to swim very fast. It would actually be a very, very slow swimmer because of all this adornment to it. All right. So here's some constraints on shape. Animals have to be able to exchange with their environment. So for a single-celled organism, which is most of the things we've been talking about besides plants, it's very easy for them to exchange with their environment. They are a single cell, so they just need to send stuff out of the cell and bring stuff into the cell. For a multicellular organism like most animals, they have needed to come up with a way to be able to exchange material with their environment for the cells that are inside of them. And that's why most animals have a tube running through the middle of them. So we have developed lungs to be able to bring air in and expel air from our body. We have tubing within our body that helps us transport nutrients. So we have blood vessels around there. We also are able to ingest food and have food pass through our body and be able to absorb nutrients from the food as it passes through us. So this has necessitated layers of cells with a gastrovascular cavity, which is what's being developed during that gastrulation process. So gastrulation leads to a gastrovascular cavity. Right? So we're going to see that all the groups of animals that we look at have a mechanism for exchanging material with their environment. So the simplest animals are like this hydra here that just have 2 layers of cells. So they have an outside layer of cells which exchanges with its environment. They have an inside layer of cells which exchanges material with the inside environment. Right? Here's kind of an example of what more complex animals do. This is kind of a stylized animal drawing. So they have external environment, then they have a bunch of tubing, and this is what I was just alluding to. They have a mouth, they have an anus, they're able to bring in nutrients and absorb those nutrients across the cell that is on the inside of the digestive system. They also then have a circulatory system that allows them to take the nutrients that they've absorbed through their digestive system and spread them out to all of their cells. And you have blood vessels that are able to go anywhere within the cell. Then they somehow need to be able to get rid of things that they don't want in their cells anymore, so they need an excretory system. So you need to be able to take waste products from cells and excrete them. And so that happens as well. They also need a respiratory system, a way of getting gas, having gas exchange across the cells. So we've seen similar things in plants. We saw the stomates in the plant leaves allowing for gas exchange in and out. They basically just allowed for a cavity around those cells to bring things in and out. Similar idea to our respiratory system, but animals have had to develop these much more complex ways of bringing in nutrients, circulating nutrients, and getting rid of waste, which is not a problem for a single-celled organism. Okay. Okay, so if you think about our gastrovascular system, so like the digestive system, it really is both internal and external at the same time, which is because it is continuous with the outside of our body, and it allows for stuff to come right into our body and be absorbed. So it's basically like having more skin layers. And we're going to see, actually, as we go through the different groups of animals, how they have different mechanisms for allowing this exchange to happen as we go through. Okay. So here's kind of an overview of the major groups of animals. And some of the major things that have come about throughout them. And we're going to be taking a sampling of these. So sponges have no true tissue. We're going to see what tissues are and what that gives our organisms. Tissues have been developed in all the other groups of animals. We then have things like cnidarians, mollusks, flatworms, annelids, roundworms, arthropods, and echinoderms, which are all called invertebrates. And invertebrates is not a monophyletic group, as you see. It's actually polyphyletic, but it is a grouping based on common structures. Some of those have either radial or bilateral symmetry. We're then going to look at vertebrates, or chordates, which include the vertebrates, which is what we're members of. And we are going to spend a fair amount of time on Tuesday talking about vertebrates. And again, we're very human-centric, so we are most interested and we actually know the most about things like birds and reptiles and amphibians and mammals, whereas vertebrates actually are only about 5% of all animal species. So they're a very, very small number of species, whereas invertebrates are a much, much bigger group. So we're going to start today by looking at some of these groups of invertebrates, not all of them, and I'm going to show you kind of the groups that we'll look at on another graphic further along here. Okay, so we're going to begin exploring some of the living phyla of vertebrates. I'm only going to pick 3 of them, actually, to highlight. And we're going to talk about some of the differences of them. So invertebrates, again, is a non-monophyletic group. It's a functional group. So just like protists, it isn't one common ancestor and all its offspring, or all its descendants. It's actually polyphyletic. So it's hard to talk about them as a whole group. So we're going to pick apart a few of them and look at them. So the 3 groups that I'm going to be discussing and we're going to go into a little more detail about are sponges, arthropods, and echinoderms. And you can see these all have different origins. Sponges are going to be the most different from the other ones. They have no true tissue. Arthropods, we're going to see, are one of the most abundant of the groups of invertebrate species, or groups of invertebrate organisms. And echinoderms are actually the closest relative of vertebrates, so they're a pretty interesting one to look at as well to see what vertebrate ancestors might have looked more like. So we're going to go into each of these groups in a little bit of detail. We may or may not get to all three of them today, probably not. And then we'll cover whatever we didn't cover today, we'll cover on Tuesday, and we'll also look at the chordates in a little more detail. And because chordates are something that are so I guess interesting to us, I'm going to break that up into different groups of chordates, and we're going to look at their differences a little bit more. So sponges. Sponges are one of the simplest forms of animals. They do not have true tissues like the rest of animals, so they are different than the rest of them. They are therefore probably pretty similar to ancestral animals. They are stationary, and they're often mistaken for plants. So some of them look drastically different from plants, but a lot of them, people would say, oh, that's just a plant, because it doesn't move, doesn't seem to be doing a lot of stuff that animals do. So by no true tissue, what I mean is that a sponge is actually just a loose association of relatively unspecialized cells. We're going to see that there's a little bit of specialization in the cells, but for the most part they're not specialized. And it's almost as if it's just a colony of cells, of independent cells, rather than cells that are working together, that all have different functions, and that's what tissues do. Tissues are a bunch of cells that will actually function as an entire unit. We don't see that in sponges. They're more independent, more of a loose association. So the thought is that these sponges evolved from colonial protists, and I didn't really go into this in much detail, but there are some protists, some green algae that live in colonies. So it's multiple cells living together. We looked at this in, we looked at slime molds. I showed you an image of slime molds and how they're individual cells that come together and they perform new functions. So it's kind of along those lines. They're just a whole bunch of cells that really live together, and together they have advantages over separate cells. So that's pretty much what sponges are. They're not true tissues or specialized cells like you'll see in the other animals. So the way sponges feed, they will suck in water through pores, and then so they've got these pores on the side. I think it shows some of them here. They suck water in, and then the water then gets pushed out the top of the sponge. So the opening on the top is the exit for the water. And as the water passes across the cells on the inside of the sponge, it gets filtered by cenocyte cells that will be actually looking for bacteria and other plankton, so other small food particles that are in the water. And then they will pass that food source to neighboring cells called amoebocytes, where that food will be broken down. So it's really just these two kind of layers of cells, where you have amoebocyte cells, which will digest the food, and you have cenocyte cells that will capture the food. And they're filter feeders, so they can only feed on what gets passed through their bodies. Okay, so again, very simple organisms, loose association of cells, have a little bit of specialization in that they have these two different cell types, but beyond that, they don't have much more specialization. They don't have things like a circulatory system, so they can only get nutrients that they themselves digest or is passed from a neighboring cell. So they do have cell junctions between them that allow them to pass things, but they have no circulatory system. There are only two cell layers, so they're always in contact with the water that's around them. They don't have any internal cells that need anything fed into them, like we'll see in other organisms. All right, that's really all I'm going to go into in sponges. They're pretty simple organisms. All right. The next group that we're going to look at are the arthropods. And arthropods are pretty important, pretty diverse group. There are about 1 million known, described living arthropod species. So this is not counting extinct species of arthropods, and guaranteed there are many, many more that we don't know about. So in terms of all the known species on Earth, arthropods are about 2/3 of the known species. So they're pretty successful, pretty important species. They're found in almost all habitats on Earth. So we're going to look, there's aquatic arthropods like lobster here. There are also terrestrial arthropods. There are arthropods that are found in the desert. There are arthropods that are found in the tropics. They're found in all different environments. Their real success is due to some of their adaptations that are manifested in their body plan. They have a segmented body that allows for many different patterns, so they can take on many different forms based on these different segments, which allows them to fill lots of different ecological roles, and we'll get into why that's important as we get through. So they have cell differentiation, which we didn't see in the sponges. They have a head region, they have a body region with the legs, they have a tail region, they have different parts to their body that have very different kind of reasons for them. Yes, yeah. It's, yeah, certain species. Yeah, so like stone crabs. So stone crabs, which are an arthropod, they can regrow limbs. So I'm sure there are limits to that, and there's probably plenty of species of arthropod that couldn't do that, but stone crabs definitely can. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and the lobsters are pretty similar to that. Yeah, and I think a lot of them can do that. They have that ability. Yeah. So, which is pretty cool. That can happen, right? We're going to see, like, there's other, and this is where there's some exceptions to that sexual reproduction requirement of animals. We'll look at some other types of animals that if they are cut in half, they'll form two new animals. So they're able to regrow tissue, regrow parts of them. Okay, some other things about them. They have an exoskeleton. So they have a hard outer region to their body, and we'll talk about some advantages and disadvantages to having that. It does provide a lot of benefits to the arthropod, having this protective coating on them. So they have that. They also have jointed appendages, which is where it gets its name. Arthropod means jointed feet, and they can also be modified in a number of ways to have different functions. So the antenna of a lobster here are modified feet, they're modified jointed appendages. Mouth parts and even reproductive organs are modifications to these jointed appendages, so they can take on many different roles. Kind of neat. All right, so just to look a little closer at the segmented body. So you have an abdomen, you have swimming appendages, so part of the tail of this lobster. So this is not the kind of lobster you'd find down here. This is a lobster, or Maine lobster, kind of a North Atlantic lobster with the giant front claws. They have legs that are adapted for walking. This lobster has arms that are adapted for crushing. So the lobsters down here have different feeding behaviors than the ones up north, where they will, ones up north will be breaking a lot of shellfish, things like that. They have, kind of pointed here is that they have different roles for the different body parts. Specialized function for the different parts. All right. One of the big things that you'll probably notice on most arthropods, so arthropods are not all marine, so their beetles are also arthropods, is the outside exoskeleton or cuticle, which is made of layers of protein and chitin. So chitin is a carbohydrate that is unique to animals, and it's found on, well, it's not unique to animals, but it's found in animals, and it's found on the exoskeleton of arthropods. So it can be hard and rigid and thick over some parts of their body, and if you've had crab or you've had lobster, you've had to crack through it to get to the organism to eat it. Or it can also be thin and flexible, so they'll have thin parts. They still have exoskeleton on the jointed parts of their legs, but it's thin and more flexible during other times. Yeah. So, all right. One of the major reasons that this has evolved is actually water conservation. So you may think protection, it's going to protect them, but it's actually to keep them from drying out. So as we'll see when we get to vertebrates, one of the major challenges for terrestrial life is preventing desiccation, preventing drying out, and this hard outer skeleton actually does that. It helps. It covers up the skin, covers up the parts of the body that could lose moisture, just like trees have, or tree leaves have that waxy outer coating to prevent them from drying out. This does that as well. It's a waxy kind of outer coating. So you will find arthropods like scorpions in the desert doing pretty well. And there are also desert spiders and things like that that are also arthropods. All right. So what are some benefits of having an exoskeleton? So what are two benefits of an exoskeleton? I kind of just mentioned one of them. But. All right. So preventing from water loss. What else do you think an exoskeleton provides for that animal? So protection, because it's hard. Can you think of any disadvantages to having your skeleton be on the outside of your body? All right, it could restrict movement. So, and in order to have movement, they have to have weak spots in the exoskeleton, like at the joints, which are going to limit the amount of protection or limit the protection from the water loss. So hard to move in it. Any other disadvantages? What do you think has to happen when they want to grow? Yeah, okay. So it's outside skeleton, it's limiting how big they can get. So in order to get bigger, they have to shed the exoskeleton, grow a little bit, and then grow a new exoskeleton. And so during that period of time, that they're going to be unprotected and they're going to risk desiccation. So whereas something that has an internal skeleton like us, our body grows and then our skeleton grows along with it. The exoskeleton, they have to shed it periodically. So, all right, so here's some cons. It has to shed its skeleton to grow. This is called molting. Molting itself is pretty energetically expensive, and it's highly vulnerable to predation during that time, and highly tasty. If you ever had soft-shell crab, that's what you're having. You're having a crab that has molted, and then you can eat the whole thing. You don't have to peel it, which is really nice. Yeah. All right. But on the opposite of this, the pros are when it's hard, it protects them. It provides a location for muscles to attach, which allows them to actually be a little bigger than, they're not just a blob of cells, they can have muscle attachment points, and it allows them to move that exoskeleton. It prevents drying out, desiccation, and it supports their body plan. So unlike some of the ones that we skipped, they're not just these blobs of cells. They can have this larger body plan, and they can move, which sponges couldn't do, because they have this exoskeleton that they can use those muscle cells to pull against to cause movement in the arms and legs, things like that. All right. So, two of these pros, body support and preventing desiccation, is what has enabled arthropods to colonize land. So, without the exoskeleton to prevent them from drying out, and without the exoskeleton to support their body weight, they would not have been able to leave water. So organisms in the water don't need that. They're floating in the water. They don't need to keep their body up. And you've probably seen this when marine animals are brought onto land. They often don't do very well because their body is crushing itself. So one of the big disadvantages to land is gravity. So these two things, preventing desiccation and body support, have allowed arthropods to colonize land. Okay. So, arthropods are bigger than sponges. I know we skipped a bunch of these things, so I didn't get to go through all the different levels of things. But just, if you compared it to sponges, they're bigger than sponges. They now have this outside shell on the body. So this has required them to have some more adaptations than the simple things we saw in the sponge. So one of the big things is that they need a way to get gases in and out of the cells that are on the inside of that exoskeleton. So what they do, they don't have lungs like we do. They have pores all throughout their body wall, and they have holes that go through the exoskeleton. The pores lead to a series of branched internal tubes that end up going to all of their body cells. Okay, so the air gets delivered directly to their body cells, not through a circulatory system. So this makes them different than humans, which we'll talk about eventually, which we bring in air and we have a specialized system for actually bringing oxygen to our circulatory system, and then our circulatory system will move that oxygen around our cells. Things like a grasshopper here, they actually have just a series of tubes which directly deliver air to the body cells. They do have a circulatory system. They do have it's a very simple circulatory system. They do have heart-like structures that pump fluid throughout their body, but that is designed for moving nutrients through the body, not for moving gas, not for moving oxygen and carbon dioxide. They have basically just tubes that go to all of their cells, and that's what's shown here. So here's the body wall, here's trachea, and then they do have air sacs that will conserve air, but then they basically deliver it right to it. So it's like a separate system just for delivering gas. Okay. All right, something else that arthropods have developed that makes them different from other organisms out there, besides their exoskeleton here, is that a lot of them can fly. So a lot of them have been able to develop flight, which allows them to escape predators, allows them to find mates, allows them to disperse really easily, and to find new habitats. So the thought is that this evolved once in the insects. Flight in different insect groups is pretty similar, and it may have been lost in some other groups of insects. But it's different than flight that's found in other organisms, which we'll see how it's done differently in some of the vertebrate forms when we look at bats and we look at birds and we look at how they do things differently. Okay. See if there's anything else about these organisms. All right. Okay, I think I will start. I have enough time to go through these. There's only a few slides on this. Okay, and the last group of animals, the third group of animals that I want you to know a little bit about are echinoderms. Echinoderms are actually the most closely related to chordates. They are pretty well defined. They include things like sea cucumbers, sea stars, sea urchins. You'll see things like that. There are about 7,000 species of echinoderms that are out there, and they have a lot of similarities to them. So in general, they're pretty slow moving or sessile, which means they don't move. So some species will not move very. They have an epidermis that covers an endoskeleton. So unlike arthropods, which had a skeleton on the outside, echinoderms have a skeleton that's inside of another layer of cells called an epidermis. So epidermis is like skin, right? So they have a skin on the outside. And their endoskeleton is made of calcareous plates. So they're made of plates of a hardened substance. Most of them have, or they all have, bilateral symmetry as larvae and almost a radial symmetry as adults. So bilateral symmetry means that the two halves are the same shape, and radial symmetry means that out from a center they have, like spokes of a wheel, they're symmetrical. So a sea star here has radial symmetry. So if you look at all directions out from the center, it's the same. And one of the big things that defines echinoderms is that they have a water vascular system. They actually will move things around within their body using water. All right. Let's see what else I have here. Okay, so here's what the water vascular system looks like in a sea star. So it has its mouth and its anus, or it has an opening right in the center of its body. It'll suck in water, and it'll actually push water through canals that run out all of its arms. And by changing the pressure of that water in the different limbs, it can lead to movement. It can also disperse nutrients throughout its body using that system. And again, the canals will lead to feet, so poda, this podum here, and those little suction cup-like feet will be extended, and they can grab onto things and allow it to move. So it uses that water vascular system a lot to help it move around. Yep. So sea stars are actually pretty crazy in the way that they feed. They actually will take their stomach and excrete it so that their stomach is on the outside of their body, and they will then digest things external and then pull the nutrients back in and then spread it throughout their body through their vascular system. So in this way, they're actually very good at feeding on things like clams and mussels, because all they do, they wrap their bodies around a mussel, they then pull on it, and they really just keep pulling until the mussel opens up just a crack. Then they'll squeeze their stomach in to that opening, digest the organism from the inside, basically, and then just suck the nutrients out. So they're very well adapted for the type of food that they work on. All right. So I'm going to stop with this group. So just those three groups, and we really focused a lot on the arthropods, just to give you some general ideas of different invertebrate species. What we'll talk about on Tuesday are groups of vertebrates, and although they're only 5% of all animals, they're really interesting, and we know a lot about them, so we're going to spend the whole time talking about the different groups and the different adaptations we found in the different groups to fill up all the different roles of land organisms that we have today. So, and we'll end with kind of humans and mammals. All right, so core dates start on Tuesday.